Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our program with Professor David Kertzer. My name is Dina Baranke-Rashis. I'm honored to serve on the boards of Combined Jewish Philanthropies, CJP, and Jewish Federations of North America, JFNA. I'm also a proud supporter of the work of the Jewish Community Relations Council, JCRC, where I serve as a member of the Yom HaShoah Holocaust Remembrance Commemoration Committee. For those of you new to JCRC, we advance the priorities of the organized Jewish community in a multitude of ways. JCRC serves as a bridge between the Jewish community and the broader community, focusing on 5 core areas: government affairs, community relations, Israel engagement, Holocaust awareness, and synagogue organizing. Through our many years of deep connections with public officials, civic leaders, faith leaders, and the media, we are able to facilitate important, timely, and oftentimes complex conversations among key parties during important moments in the life of our community. Many of you may be familiar with CJP's recently released 5-point plan to combat anti-Semitism. One key facet of this plan is education. Through conversations like the one we will have today, we can learn what history teaches us about the dangers of Jew hatred and bigotry unchecked. I encourage all of you to share what you learned today with others, and please consider joining me for this year's Yom HaShoah Holocaust commemoration on Sunday, April 16th at 2 p.m. We will be in person at Faneuil Hall for the first time in several years. More information can be found at the link in the chat. I now turn the conversation over to my friend and teacher, JCRC CEO, Jeremy Burton. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Gina, and thank you for being an amazing friend and partner and leader in our work. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Professor David Kertzer to discuss his incredible, relatively new book, The Pope at War, and all of his work. Professor Kertzer has been the Dupee University Professor of Social Science at Brown University since 1992. He is also a professor of anthropology and Italian studies. He is an authority on Italian politics, society and history, political symbolism, and anthropological demography. In 2005, Professor Kertzer was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science. He is the past president of the Social Science History Association and of the Society for the Anthropology of Europe, and he served as Provost of Brown University from 2006 to 2011. He is the author of what I was told to say are many books. Most recently, the book we'll be discussing, The Pope at War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler. A previous book, The Pope and Mussolini, The Secret History of Pius XI and the Rise of Fascism in Europe, won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2015. He has a much more extensive biography. We will link to it in the chat. David's going to start by offering us some reflections on his work and his process, and then we'll move to a discussion and some questions from the audience. I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom at any time to submit your questions for Professor Kertzer. And now I want to welcome David Kertzer, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to the organizers for this occasion to discuss my recent book. What I thought I'd do is just spend maybe 5 minutes to give you a little idea about why I came to write this book and what I see as perhaps its significance, and then we'll begin our conversation with Jeremy, and then I look forward to your questions as well. The book is, and I think we have some illustrations here. There's the cover of the book and the personalities who are at the center of it, the Pope Pius XII, the controversial Pope, and that's a picture of Mussolini and Hitler riding in a car when Hitler visited Rome in the spring of 1938. The book is about how the controversial Pope Pius XII dealt with the war and the Holocaust and why he acted the way he did. The genesis of the book goes back a long way. In fact, in some ways, there's a kind of personal history here as well, because in 1944, here, I think the next slide has a picture. My father was a rabbi in, if we can go to the next slide, there it is, who was a chaplain with the US Army during the war, with the troops who had landed in January 1944 to the south of Rome at Anzio Beachhead, and would be involved a few months later in early June in the liberation of Rome. But meanwhile, while he was, for example, conducting this service in a wine cellar, they were under fierce bombardment by the Germans. But in addition to this kind of family link to this story, there are some scholarly historical reasons for wanting to do this book as well. There are few historical controversies as bitter as the one that surrounds the actions and inactions of the Pope during World War II. There was, some of you may recall, a book by John Cornwell called Hitler's Pope, came out about 25 years ago. And the title Hitler's Pope gives you an idea of his very critical position about the role of the Pope during the war. The next slide, I think, shows some of the basis for the controversy. There was also, before his book in 1963, some of you may recall, a play by a German playwright, Ralph Hachuth, The Deputy, which really triggered the general controversy, public controversy over the silence of the Pope during the Holocaust. And as you see in the middle there, portrayed 12 thick volumes of the documents that, in reaction to the play The Deputy and trying to defend the Vatican, the Pope at the time, Paul VI, had a group of Jesuit historians put together a selection of documents from World War II. The archives were not open to the rest of us, and they were published between 1965 and 1981. In fact, there were those who said that given that publication of the thousands of documents by the Vatican, when they eventually would open the Vatican archives, there'd be nothing new to be found. That turns out not to be the case. A few years ago, partly having confidence that Pope Francis, after decades of demands to open these archives, would, as part of his drive for transparency in the church, allow them to be opened, I began working in the archives that were opened, because there are many important archives for diving into this history besides the Vatican archives. For example, not only the Italian regime had its envoy to the Vatican, its ambassador, but so did the German Nazi regime have its ambassador to the Vatican. There were also allied envoys in the Vatican throughout the war years, from France, from the US, from Britain. They're all sending almost daily reports back to their governments of the conversations they're having, not only with the Pope, but with the men, the prelates around the Pope. So it's lucky that I'd already identified and digitized tens of thousands of pages of documents from those other archives before the announcement of the opening of the Vatican archives. They finally were opened on March 2nd, get the date right, March 2nd, 2020. The date is important because if you remember what was going on in March 2020, Italy was the epicenter of a new epidemic. And I think the next page, if we look at the next slide here, I should say that I'd done this previous book. This is another reason for wanting to write this book. I had done this book 5 or 6 years ago that looked at the earlier years, the relationship between the Vatican and the Pope at the time, Pius XI, and Mussolini and the fascist regime. So this new book is kind of a continuation, in a way, of that earlier story. The following slide then shows my entry, along with others, this is from the morning of the opening of the archives for the World War II period for the papacy of Pius XII, March 2nd, 2020. There I'm standing next to Hubert Wolff, who's the main German historian of this period. He's also a priest and done some very good work on this history. The problem, of course, was that after 1 week of intensive work in that archive, together with my associate, Roberto Benedetti, they closed it because of COVID, and we didn't know when they were reopening it. A few days later, they closed down the country, and I basically had to leave. Fortunately, they reopened the archives just a few months later, 3 months later, in June 2020. And while foreigners basically weren't able to get into the country because of COVID, my collaborator, Roberto Benedetti, who's Roman and was living there, was able to work essentially daily. We were in daily conversation, and basically we ended up with about 8,000 pages digitized of those newly open archives of the juiciest documents of greatest relevance and interest. So what I try to do in the book is basically triangulate the documents from the Vatican with the other documents from these other 5 nations' archives to reconstruct what was happening almost on a day-by-day basis during those fateful years. As I mentioned, there were some who said there wouldn't be anything new. A lot was already known about this history, but in fact, much was buried, much was being concealed. I would just mention, if we go to the next slide, one of the more clamorous, striking examples was for 80 years until I discovered these and wrote about them in my book, the fact that Hitler saw an opportunity within weeks of the Pope's election in 1939 and sent a secret envoy to negotiate with the Pope. This man here, Prince Philip von Hessen, who himself is a very colorful figure, married to the daughter of the King of Italy at the time. And incredibly, what I found also were virtual transcripts of the conversations between Hitler's envoy and the Pope in these months. So I would just say we could, I think, turn to the final slide here of this book, that I think it's important before we turn to our discussion to realize that the kind of denial that we see with the Vatican, that is, they stick to this narrative that the Vatican had always been anti-fascist, that had courageously opposed Nazism and fascism, that it had saved untold numbers of Jews. This is part of a larger kind of denial of history of the Holocaust and World War II that one finds in other places, and most notably as an Italian historian for me in Italy, where one often gets the impression Italians think they were together with the Allies in World War II and not, in fact, allied with Hitler in World War II. So with those comments, I look forward to Jeremy's questions and then other questions from those participating. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Kertzer. And we're already seeing many questions starting to come in, and which we'll hope to incorporate them into this conversation. You've opened up a lot of paths for our discussion, and I know we're eager to hear about those elements of your book and the research that are new revelations or new understandings based on the opened archives. But I'd like to just sort of pull back out for starters and ask you to do a little bit of context setting overall, because you do present a great deal of complexity in this book. And one of the aspects that you lay out at great length is the navigation that the Vatican and the Pope was doing between a perception of a threat from the Soviet Union, the sense of the threat or the challenge of the church in the German space, and then, of course, in the early years of World War II, the dynamic of both the Soviet Union and Germany in Poland. And I'm wondering if you could speak more broadly to the sort of the geopolitical worldview that the Pope was holding before the actual Holocaust began.
Well, I think it's important, in fact, to look at different periods. We talk about, the attitude of the Vatican toward the Nazi regime or toward fascism and so on. It all depends when. And if we look at the early years of the war, the Pope had good reason to believe that Hitler was going to win the war, especially with by spring of 1940, Hitler sends his troops through Belgium, through the Netherlands, into France. There was what's supposed to be the impregnable Maginot Line that had been set up as the defense by the French. The Germans just went through it in a matter of days and march on Paris. Meanwhile, they've taken over the Balkans. They've taken over much of North Africa. And the British have been driven ignominiously from Dunkirk off the continent. So the Pope was concerned about the survival of the church and how the church would do in a Europe that would come under the thumb of Hitler and his ally Mussolini. And so I think to understand his actions, a lot of it can be seen as motivated by how to, as he saw it, protect the church in those circumstances. As far as communism goes, this became an issue. Well, it was an issue fairly early in the war, in that, of course, the church wasn't happy when Mussolini joins the war at Hitler's side, and they're still 1940. It's when Mussolini joins the war in June. They're still allied with the Soviet Union, who, of course, was represented the absolute evil from the church's point of view and the Pope's point of view. But this would all change pretty soon because, of course, in 1941, the spring of 41, Germany invades the USSR. And now it's the Axis that is defending Europe from the communist threat. And this is certainly how Hitler and Mussolini portray it, and to some extent how the Pope viewed it as well. So later in the war, the Pope is concerned that the complete defeat of Germany would mean a victory of the Soviet Union that was going to flood into much of Central Europe, if not, and also communist uprisings in Italy, France, elsewhere in Catholic Europe. This all was of great concern to the Pope. So this is why later in the war, he still was unwilling to criticize the Nazis. I mean, it's part of the reason. If we look at, and he was worried that if he did anything that seemed critical of the Nazis, and then the Germans lost the war, the German Catholics would blame him in part for their defeat.
I hope you could talk. I suspect that for many in our audience, and this is largely an audience of the Jewish community in Boston, we're somewhat more familiar with the Nazi regime in Germany than we are with the Mussolini regime in Italy, and that frankly gets less coverage in our study of the Holocaust. I'm hoping you could speak a little bit to the overall context of the Vatican's relationship with the state in Italy and how that particular relationship was important to the Pope.
Well, the Italian state, many people think of it as having been around forever, but it actually was new creation, relatively new creation at the time. It was only created in a war against the papacy. Italy was divided for many, many years into a series of kingdoms and duchies and whatnot. But in the middle, for over 1,000 years, lay the papal states ruled over by the Pope. So in trying to unify Italy, those who were seeking to unify Italy with the Risorgimento had the Pope as really their main enemy. And it would only be through literally a battle, a military battle, that the Pope was defeated and the papal states were dissolved and unified Italy was created. So Rome only became the capital of Italy in 1871. And at that time, the Pope at the time, Pius IX, excommunicated the king and the prime minister and all those who would, were responsible for this defeat of the papal states. It was only with Mussolini, even though Mussolini, the Pope at the time, realized Pius XI became Pope the same year as Mussolini became prime minister in 1922. And the Pope realized that Mussolini didn't have a religious bone in his body. In fact, previously he had been known as an anti-cleric, but each saw an advantage to making a deal with the other. And this would culminate in 1929 with the Lateran Accords. And that's what establishes Vatican City. But Vatican City did not exist as a sovereign entity until Mussolini created it in 1929. It's also what ended the separation of church and state in Italy, which had been a founding principle of liberal Italy. So basically, the Vatican made a deal with Mussolini, and for the most part was happy with it. There were grounds for conflict every once in a while. So this is the general background. Now, when Mussolini in 1938 introduces the anti-Semitic racial laws, which throw all Jewish children out of schools, dismiss Jews from almost all sections of the economy, impoverish them, the only objection that is expressed by the Vatican is that some people who are regarded by the church as Catholic are being treated as Jews and therefore subject to the anti-Semitic legislation, so that the converted Jews should not, according to the church, be treated subject to the racial laws. There was this controversy over that, but for the rest, the racial laws really put into action the kind of rules that the church itself had imposed for hundreds of years in Rome, for example, where Jews were ghettoized, were not allowed to mingle with Christians, were not allowed to go to school with Christians, were prevented from most professions and so forth. So this is the general background. I just say one other thing is that when we compare Italy with other countries in Europe, it had a very small Jewish population, had an ancient one over 2,000 years old, but there are only around 40,000 or maybe 45,000 Jews in Italy. So it was represent about 1/10 of 1% of the Italian population. We think of Poland, about 10% of Polish. Poland was Jewish, about 1% of Germany. So you kind of, it's almost a geometric progression down to the Italian situation.
So before we delve more specifically into the Pope's relationship with the Jewish community and the specifics of the Holocaust and Italy, I'm hoping, and people are very interested in the fact that there are these new archives open, and you've delved into them with your colleague. What comes from these archives in understanding more deeply how the Vatican was internally discussing its relationship with the Mussolini and Hitler regimes?
Well, one thing that becomes clear is that there were a number of people around the Pope who were very anti-Semitic, and that this did influence what the Pope did. I mean, if we now talk specifically about the attitude toward the Jews and eventually the Holocaust, the Pope, one thing we discover is that the Pope had a prelate in the Secretary of State office he regarded as his major expert on Jews, and to whom he turned when questions came up. So that, for example, in the fall of 1942, President Roosevelt sends a message to the Pope and says, we have these horrible reports of massive attempts by the Germans to exterminate the Jews of Europe. And if you have any evidence that can help confirm this, this would be very helpful. So the Pope turns to this prelate for advice. The prelate, by the way, his name's Angelo Dell'Acqua, would later become Cardinal Vicar of Rome, so would go on to have an illustrious career in the church. And Dell'Acqua writes him a memo, which actually the Pope follows. And Dell'Acqua says, yes, it's true, we are getting these reports, and we know now they had many such reports, but it would not be wise to let Roosevelt know about it, give him any of this evidence, because why not? Because undoubtedly the Americans would use it as part of their anti-Nazi propaganda and citing the Vatican as the source to show that it's verified it wasn't just their propaganda, and we don't want this to happen. Or to give another example, also involving the same person, in well, we can maybe later talk about October 16th, 1943, which is a famous roundup of the Jews of Europe, of Rome, when they're over 1,000 are sent to Auschwitz. But shortly after that, this is now during the German occupation of Italy, of much of Italy, which began in September 1943. In November 30th, 1943, Mussolini has been set up in a kind of puppet regime by the Nazis up in the north of Italy called the Republic of Salo. And his government announces a new policy. The order is given by the Minister of Internal Affairs in charge of the police that all Jews in Italy should be arrested and sent to concentration camps. All their property should be seized. And so one of the Pope's advisors, a very interesting figure, who's a Jesuit, Pietro Tacchi Venturi, sends a memo that reaches the Pope, which says, maybe we should protest. He's not calling for public protests even, but just privately protest to the German ambassador to the Holy See. And so again, they send this memo asking for the Pope, for the Vatican to lodge a protest to this same member of the Secretary of State office. And he writes a long memo, which is filled with vituperative anti-Semitic tropes. And again, saying we should not be speaking out in this way. And so, these are the kinds of things that now have come to light with the opening of the archives.
So I'd say get a little more specific on some of what you touched on, and I found it very fascinating in the book. A lot of what we have discussed in sort of understanding the Holocaust and sort of the Allies' response has been who knew what when. And you go to a place like Yad Vashem, and there are exhibits about those who try to inform Roosevelt about the Holocaust. I did not personally know until reading your book, and this comes out in the material you had. And I guess intellectually, this should be obvious once it's said, that there were Catholic priests serving as military chaplains to the Italian, in particular the Italian units, but I guess also the German units on the Eastern Front, who you write about how they were reporting back on the genocide that was occurring on the Eastern European Front. And so I guess there's an element of this that before we even get to the question of how the Pope responded to the roundup of the Jews of Rome or something, about what the Pope actually knew about the final solution.
Well, yes, the Pope was getting all sorts of reports from early on. I mean, on one hand, kind of famously, there's a Roman priest who's a chaplain with the Italian army who's going back and forth on the hospital train to the Eastern Front, who's actually meeting with the Pope and reporting and also writing up long reports, which include graphic descriptions of the mass murder of Jews going on. But more generally, there's this large capillary structure of the church in Europe, in the Catholic areas of Europe, certainly like Poland and elsewhere, where there are archbishops, bishops, and others reporting into the Vatican on what's going on. So the Pope, the other thing to keep in mind with the Holocaust, we talk about the kind of Holocaust by bullets in particularly the first years of the Holocaust, where huge numbers of Jews were murdered just by being machine gunned down and digging their own trenches to be their bodies thrown in. And the Pope was getting plenty of reports of this. Later, he'd get reports of the concentration camps there. I think it would be a little while till a lot of the most graphic details came out. So I wouldn't say he was the first to know about the gas chambers and so on. But before too long, they were getting these reports as well. So the Pope was quite well informed about what was going on.
So let's take that forward and then talk about the expulsion of the Jews of Rome, how the Jews of it, you touched on this already. What were the discussions inside the Vatican specifically about the treatment of the Italian Jews?
Well, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the persecution of Italy's Jews didn't begin with the World War II. They began in 1938 with the racial laws, which came as a shock to many Italian Jews, because it wasn't like the German situation where the Nazis, part of their DNA was their anti-Semitism, but this wasn't true of the fascist regime. In fact, there were probably as high a proportion of Jews who were members of the fascist party as Catholics in the 1920s and early 30s. So that in those earlier years, there was there was the situation that there wasn't a conflict really between fascism and Italian Jews as a whole. This would only begin in 38. By terms of the church reaction to all this, as I said, they hadn't opposed the racial laws, but of course they were opposed to the mass murder of Italy's Jews or Jews anywhere. So the position of the church at the time was largely, Jews should be kept in their place. They were a danger to good Christian society, but one certainly shouldn't go around murdering Jews. That said, I mean, I think the October 16th, 1943 gives a good indication of this. So this is about a month after the Germans occupy Rome, after the initial fall of Mussolini. The Allies have landed in Sicily and are beginning their march up the peninsula. And basically Hitler orders the roundup of the Jews of Rome. A bunch of 350 SS are sent to Rome. And on the morning of October 16th, 1943, they go, 100 of them to the ghetto, where there's a heavy concentration, the old ghetto, heavy concentration of Jews, but 250 to other parts of Rome, together with their clipboards with the addresses of all the Jews of Rome. They round up 1,259 and they put them in a military college right outside Vatican City, so practically bordering Vatican City. And then they're held for 2 days before they're sent out. So now the Pope is in this kind of dramatic situation where, aside from the fact he's not happy about this, also it makes him look very bad that he's doing nothing, because he's already been under pressure to say something about what's going on in the war, and not only, by the way, about persecution of Jews, but also the invasion of Catholic Poland and what was going on to priests there. But what happened? So on the one hand, the Pope has his Secretary of State summon the German ambassador to the Holy See, and tells him, the Pope feels very sad about this. Isn't there something the German ambassador could do? The German ambassador responds to the Cardinal Secretary of State, it's the number 2 of the Pope, saying, this has been ordered by the very top, meaning Hitler. Do you really want me to lodge a complaint with my government about this? And to which they say, oh no, I didn't say that. But what do they do? Well, one thing that becomes clear after the opening of these archives is that this strange divergence between the number of Jews who were rounded up on October 16th and the number of Jews 2 days later put on the train had never been fully explained. So 1,259 Jews are rounded up, put in the military college, but only 1,007, more or less, are put on the train. So about 250 actually have been released. Who were those Jews who were released? Well, we see behind the scenes, the Vatican is busily sending through the German ambassador, a list of baptized Jews, and also Jews who had officially church-sanctioned marriages with Catholics. That is, they got sanctioned by agreeing that any children in the marriage would be raised Catholic. And so basically these were Jews who were heads of Catholic families, and that's who was let go. So despite all the talk about how the Nazis only regarded Jews from racial terms, had nothing to do with religion, not true. And I think that becomes clear with these really recently open archives. The Germans did not want to antagonize the Pope. They were portraying themselves as great defenders of Christian Europe at the time against the communist and Jewish threat. And so, when we talk about what actions the Vatican took, a lot of what we see has to do with their actions on behalf of baptized Jews and these so-called mixed marriages.
I know part of this conversation is we want to encourage people to read the whole book, and there are many revelations and new findings in the book. But since you just touched on meetings that the Pope and others had specifically with regard to the roundup of the Jews, I'm hoping you can talk just a little bit about a meeting that didn't happen and the notes that you uncovered regarding the request from the chief rabbis of Palestine, both the Ashkenazi and Sephardic chief rabbis, who requested an audience regarding the treatment of the Jews.
Right, in July 1944, and the date's important because it comes a month after the Allies liberate Rome. This is no longer the immediate threat of German occupation of Rome. And the Pope was very happy with the way the liberation happened because the Germans did not do anything to destroy Rome. They were still trying to portray themselves as defenders of Christianity. So the Pope was greatly relieved, was meeting with various Allied generals and eventually people like de Gaulle and Eisenhower and so on, or Mark Clark, who was head of the army. Eisenhower, I think, was busy up north with Normandy and so forth. But this is the circumstance of the environment in which the chief rabbis of Palestine requested a meeting with the Pope. And the Pope decided he didn't want to meet with them, or that it would not be a good idea to meet with them, so turned them down. And he sent a message saying he was doing everything he could for Jews, but this wasn't the moment. Why would he turn them down? He still didn't want to be publicly identified as speaking out on behalf of Jews. The word Jews never crossed his lips during the Holocaust or during the war. This is now comes to light with these archives that are open.
So you've touched on the arrival of the Allies in Rome, and there are a bunch of questions in the chat, and I know you discussed this in your book, and you referenced earlier the Vatican's concern at the early stages of the war, the idea that the Nazis might actually win, and therefore they would have to navigate a Nazi Europe. There's clearly a point in your book and in the war in which the tide turned and that was no longer a given. And from your reporting and what you write about, it's not clear that the Pope embraced that tide turning, I'm going to say.
Yeah, well, he certainly didn't change his basic position. I mean, he had been under pressure. We talk about the silence of the Pope in terms of the Holocaust, but actually the silence of the Pope became an issue on the first day of the war, which is generally dated to the German invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. The Germans invade Poland, and one of the first things they do is arrest hundreds of Roman Catholic priests because they are seen as fonts of nationalist resistance, Polish nationalist resistance, and hundreds of them are sent to concentration camps. So the German clergy, as well as the Polish clergy, as well as the Polish political class, is begging the Pope to speak out. Again, having nothing to do with Jews, but having to do with what the Germans are doing to Catholics and especially Catholic clergy in Poland, and the Pope refuses to do so. But now, by late 42, certainly by January 43, with what's going on in Stalingrad and elsewhere in North Africa, now the presence of the Americans has really been felt in the war. It becomes much more likely than not that the Germans are going to lose the war. But now, I mean, there are a couple of things I think people don't fully glom onto when they talk about this, which is who is murdering all the Jews? They weren't people who thought they were pagans. They were people who thought they were Christians. I mean, maybe there were a handful of pagans, but of course, not just Catholic Protestants. And there were probably more Protestants than Catholics in the Third Reich at the time. But there was certainly over 40% of the population was Roman Catholic of the Wehrmacht, of the German army, and so on. So the Pope was worried that if he denounced what they were doing, he might risk a schism in the church. And there had been a kind of schism in the Protestant church in Germany with a more Nazified church versus a less Nazified church. And this he didn't want to see. So aside from the question I mentioned earlier about worried about being blamed for German loss in the war by German Catholics, he was also worried that he would antagonize a major segment of the Catholic population of Germany. And after all, the German Catholic clergy had been supporting the war. It's important that just, I think, 2.5 years ago, the German Roman Catholic hierarchy came out with a kind of mea culpa, a statement of apology for the fact that they never had spoken out in opposition to the mass murder of the Jews by the Germans, and had never encouraged all good Germans to do their part in the war fighting in Hitler's army. So this is the context.
Thank you for that. And, I think part of the question of why are we having this conversation today? Why is this work relevant today? And you touched on this already just now, and I'd like to really spend some time here, is the post-World War II discussion. You showed in your opening slides the copious files that were released in up to 1981 by the Vatican. Obviously, many of us are familiar with Vatican II and the church's internal conversation in the years after the war about anti-Semitism. What has been the discussion since the war about the Pope and the Nazis, and also what has been the discussion around your book and your work?
Well, first of all, it is important to say that with Vatican II, all this radically changed. That is, the centuries of demonization of the Jews by the church was abandoned, and a whole new chapter, much welcome chapter in relations between the Catholic Church and Jews began. So that's important to recognize. It wouldn't begin under Pius XII. So he was Pope until 1958. Of course, didn't recognize the state of Israel. He never really talked about the Holocaust in any meaningful way, much less the fact that the church or Christianity might bear some responsibility for the demonization of Jews that could have made the Holocaust possible. The the reaction to, well, and in 1998, I think it was, the Vatican put out a statement that was 11 years in the making by a commission headed by a cardinal appointed by Pope John Paul II, a statement called We Remember. This was in reaction to the criticism that the church bore some responsibility for anti-Semitism that allowed the Holocaust to happen. And that statement basically rejects that entirely. It says that the Catholic Church had nothing to do with the kinds of what they call social, economic, political, racial anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust, that the church was just responsible, not even the institutional church, but unfortunately some sons and daughters of the church had anti-religious ideas about the Jews, but that had nothing to do with the Holocaust. None of this is historically defensible, but that's been and remains the position of the Vatican. So when my book came out, unfortunately, from my point of view, it came out, the Italian edition came out a couple of weeks before the American edition, so now over half a year ago. The Vatican Daily newspaper devoted a full page to denouncing the book, and 2 days later, the daily newspaper of the church hierarchy of Italy called L'Avvenire basically cribbed that denunciation and added some further denunciatory comments, in this case, clearly by someone who never read the book. So while I hear from many Catholics that they find it important to actually look with clear eyes at this past and to come to terms with it and understand it, and there are some Catholic publications that have published very positive reviews of the book. In terms of the Vatican and the Italian Church, it's still, they're digging in their heels, I'd say.
As a follow-up question, has there been a different reception in the non-Italian church?
Well, I haven't yet heard in that, well, the American church, one disappointment I had, so there've been a couple of, maybe more than a couple of reviews in Catholic publications, the US. One was very positive, but one that really, I'd say bothered me was the Jesuit publication, America, some of you are probably familiar with, gave my book to be reviewed by someone who described himself, he wasn't a scholar, he was a lawyer, as a kind of member of the Pius XII for Sainthood Committee. And predictably, he, denounced the book. So this was kind of disappointing because while the Jesuits in Italy have been notoriously defensive about their stridently anti-Semitic past, the Jesuits in the US, and I've heard from a number of Jesuits who've read the book and reacted very positively, but that the kind of main Jesuit magazine in the United States would maintain this position is troubling to me.
I will say candidly, I've heard very positive things from some Catholic interlocutors of ours here in Greater Boston. And as you note, and then we discuss this, Vatican II has happened, a lot has progressed in the relationship between the Catholic and the Jewish communities since the Holocaust, and have had incredible partnerships and support with each other. And yet there's also this discomfort around looking at history and being open-eyed about the past. And I will, I guess it's worth noting, many people have praised your book, and one of them is James Carroll, who was, famously wrote Constantine's Sword, which in incredible detail examines the relationship of Christian history to the Shoah. And he writes that, if the faint-hearted Pope was no war criminal, he was surely no saint. And with Kertzer's magnum opus, the book on Pius XII is written, the dispute resolved, and the case is closed, which is certainly high praise for your book. There's a question in the chat, and I guess, is the case closed? Are there other documents that you haven't yet seen, or are there documents that you would still like to see, or you would encourage your students to continue looking for?
Yes, well, my publisher, Random House, their initial draft of their publicity for my book said, the definitive account on this. And I told them, no, you've got to take that out, that no respectable historian would ever claim to have written the definitive account, that there's nothing else that could be said. And undoubtedly, there are going to be other elements that will come to light. I doubt they will change the general narrative of my book, but certainly there'll be interesting aspects that will come out. I would also say that there are some church archives that have not yet been opened. For example, one that I'd love to see opened is the Cardinal Vicar of Rome's archive. You want to understand, for example, what happened during the German occupation of Rome in terms of the relations between the church and the military authorities while the Jews were being rounded up and so on. That would be an important archive, but it's not yet open. So not all the ecclesiastical archives actually are open. The other thing is, one of the things I'm working on now is they've made available actually online, which is quite remarkable, about 35,000 pages of their so-called Jews file of the Secretary of State office. This was made available when they opened the archives, but the only way I could read them was when I was physically present in the Secretary of State archives in the bowels of Vatican City. Now I can just download it all. I've read through about the first 20,000 pages, and there's a lot of remarkable stuff there. So there are a lot of particularly personal stories, individual stories that are yet to come out that cast light on the history of the Holocaust and the role played by the Vatican and reactions to the Vatican. But so I think there's still more to the story.
We're coming close to the end of our hour, and I do want to talk about your conclusions and the epilogue in your book. But before we get there, there are some audience questions specifically about the Americans in Italy and the response of the Vatican, both with regard to the bombing of Rome and the threat of the bombing of the Vatican, and as regards to American soldiers, particularly American Black soldiers arriving in Rome. And I wonder if you could speak to that for a minute.
Yeah, so the Pope, when virtually the day when Mussolini throws Italy into the war, which is June 10th, 1940, the Pope begins frantically to contact the Allied, then the British and French ambassadors and governments to beg them to be sure that Rome is not bombed. And this is going to be, then later, of course, the US, once the US enters the war, they're doing the same with the US. Interestingly, the reaction of Roosevelt is very different than the reaction of Churchill, partly because London has been mercilessly bombed and Washington hasn't. Churchill has absolutely no sympathy for this request, and in fact, remarks that the Pope never protested against the bombing of London or other British cities, and now he doesn't want us to bomb the capital, one of the Axis capitals. Roosevelt was in a very different position because among the bases of his political support were American Catholics, and so he was quite concerned about being seen as a friend of the Pope and helping out the Pope. And so this actually became somewhat of a grounds for conflict between Churchill and American President Roosevelt. And so this would continue. In fact, the Allies kind of postponed bombing. They mercilessly bomb Milan and Genoa, other parts of Italy, Naples, Palermo. But it would be only in July 43 that they first bomb Rome, and the bombing would be, compared to some of those other cities, a lot less because of, and at that time they're very careful not to bomb Vatican City and try to avoid bombing churches. Of course, this is difficult given didn't have the precision bombing that apparently we have today. I think the question about Black soldiers comes about because one of the things that the Pope does as the Allies are moving up and look like they're coming to Rome is ask the Americans to be sure, get the message to Roosevelt not to allow Black soldiers into Rome. And although the documents in the Vatican that recount this don't explain it, what it relates to is there was a part of the fascist government that was still existing in a good part of Italy's campaign against the Allies and to try to marshal support for the fascist and Axis cause was to have actually portray pictures of Black Allied soldiers ravishing Italian women and raping them and so forth. And there were some actual instances having to do with Moroccan troops. Actually, it wasn't African Americans by any means, but Moroccan troops, where at least there were reports that the Axis and the Italian fascists made a big deal of violence against women, Italian women, by Allied soldiers coming up the peninsula. So, this was the environment in which the Pope was acting at the time.
So I'd like to come to the epilogue of your book and to your conclusions. I started this hour referencing the complexity that you offer in your book. And earlier you said that the Germans did not want to antagonize the Pope. So as we come to the end of our hour, what are your conclusions about this Pope? And I'm not going to read from the epilogue because, again, we want to encourage people to buy the book, but you clearly have laid out a case about someone who was a defender of an institution who maybe did not recognize or did not see their own power in relationship to the powers around them, and often chose to do nothing. I'm wondering if you could speak to that and what ultimately you come to as you think about this chapter of Vatican history and the Pope's leadership.
For me, as I see it, my main focus, I guess, is different than what seems to be the focus of others. Most others have written about this. I mean, he wasn't Hitler's Pope, certainly, and he saw Nazism as a threat to Catholicism. Was not happy that in Germany, for example, where many Catholic children used to go to parochial schools, now the parochial schools are being closed because Hitler wanted them all to learn, Nazi ideology in public schools. The seminaries were closed and so on. So it certainly wasn't the Pope had any love for Hitler, certainly not. But he was intimidated by Hitler and intimidated by Mussolini. So, but the responsibility he had, from my point of view, had to do with the fact that both Hitler and Mussolini certainly were using church history of demonization of the Jews to turn people against Jews and have them seen as that it would be okay to murder them. So it's, this is where I think there's a particular responsibility of a Pope as leader of the Christian church. Of course, there's a Protestant part of this too, but now talking about the Pope. So the Pope remaining silent when even throughout the earlier decades of the 20th century, church publications were filled with vilification of Jews as seeking world domination and being dangerous to good Christian society and so on. I mean, this is where, for me, the main responsibility of the Pope to have spoken out comes from. And that's why I think his decision not to risk what I think his decision not to risk problems in the church, saving the institutional church and its membership. This is the priority he had, and is not really defensible from my point of view. But leave it to others to judge. I guess I tried to just to reconstruct the history of what actually did happen.
Well, there's probably an entire other hour we could discuss regarding the specifics of the Vatican's media and the papers that the Vatican distributed and published in Italy, and the role of those in this entire conversation. But we are at the end of our hour, and I note again in your conclusion, and to the point you just made, that essentially you conclude that the Pope was successful in doing nothing, I believe is a paraphrase of something you write in the book. And I wonder if you have any final thoughts before I wrap this up about this work and the continuing conversation.
Well, I don't recall using the phrase successful in doing nothing. He did do, he has defenders. Well, one thing to keep in mind is there's still a large number of people who want to see him made a saint. This is an active effort. And if you go on Twitter, you will see, in fact, many people saying he was the last Pope. There has been no legitimate Pope because from the parts of the right wing of the Catholic Church, it's with the next Pope, John the 23rd, that the church went off the rails with the Second Vatican Council. And so Pius XII has become a hero to a certain segment of the conservatives in the church. So that the response to my book and the response to coming to terms with this history has to be also understood in terms of a current battle, which is largely against Pope Francis, of course, who's seen as part of this progressive part of the church where the church has abandoned its basic principles of thousands of years, 2,000 years. So in that sense, it's part of an ongoing battle and not just a matter of history.
Well, thank you, Professor, for joining us today. I think this is a very illuminating and informative chat, and I really do encourage people. We'll put a link in the chat where you can go to purchase the book, The Pope at War, and to check out your other books. I think there's a lot that, to continue this discussion. And to your final point there is certainly a continuing conversation about the place of the Pope in Catholic history and the place of the Pope in the Catholic sainthood that I don't think is going to go away today or tomorrow or next year, and something we will all be continuing to be interested in. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for the thoughtful questions. We didn't get to all of them, but we tried to incorporate some of them into the conversation. And I'd also like to thank Dina Rashes for her introduction and for her friendship and support of this work. And as Dina said, I remind everybody, I hope you'll join us on Sunday, April 16th at 2 p.m. when we have Boston's annual community-wide gathering for Yom HaShoah and our Holocaust commemoration at Faneuil Hall, which will, as Dina mentioned, be the first time we are returning to in-person at Faneuil Hall and the New England Holocaust Memorial since the beginning of COVID. And just for JCRC, for those of you who are interested, on March 9th, we're going to be having our legislative reception honoring our partners on Beacon Hill. And I encourage you to visit our brand new website to learn more about these events and the work of JCRC. We will include a link in the chat. So thank you again, Professor Kertzer, and thank you everybody for being with us today.
Thank you.